Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bartosz Adamczewski. He is an associate professor of biblical studies at the Faculty of Theology at Cardinal Stefan, Wyszyński, University of Warsaw, Poland. He has written numerous commentaries on the Bible, including the Gospel of Mark, Samuel, and Kings, Deuteronomy and Judges, the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of Matthew, which will be a major topic today. The Gospel of Matthew. We will also be talking about the Gospel of Luke as well. Today's topic will center around Adamczewski's book, The Gospel of Matthew, a Hypertextual Commentary, European Studies in Theology, Philosophy, and History of Religion, Book 16. History of Religion is Book 16. I'll have the link in the description below, so if any of you want to go buy the book, I highly recommend it. It's available on Amazon and other retailers as well. Okay, well, thank you for joining me, Professor Adamczewski.
Good evening, or yes, I don't know your time now. Say good evening.
So my first question for you is, well, what led you to conclude that the Gospel of Matthew is the third gospel and it is aware of Luke Acts? What are like the central points, the most important points you think that convinced you that the Gospel of Matthew is the third gospel?
So the first idea started surprising with my study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, not of the Gospels. So first, I realized that the Gospel of Luke, which was traditionally regarded as a very Greek gospel, is in fact very well acquainted with the ideas, Jewish ideas that we encounter in the Dead Sea Scrolls, non-biblical Jewish ideas that are contained, for example, in the so-called Damascus document. On the other hand, the Gospel of Matthew seems to rely generally on established canonical works, which we today call the Old Testament. So the first idea was, if Luke was so well acquainted with the Jewish traditions and Matthew was rather acquainted with the standard biblical books, so maybe the order of their origin or writing composition was in fact this: first Luke and then Matthew. So this was my first suspicion, because I wanted to choose a good topic for my habilitation. We have something like this, like in Germany, we have this in Poland, after the doctorate, to write a good book called habilitation. And I wanted to write something about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I analyzed almost everything in them. And then I came back to the Gospels because of my friend, who persuaded me to take the Gospels as a subject of my habilitation and not the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I turned back to the Gospels with this idea that Matthew is not as Hebrew as it was traditionally regarded to be. And on the other hand, Luke is not as Greek as he was considered by so many scholars. So it was my first suspicion. Then I read a book written by Martin Hengel, a very good German scholar, which was published in paperback in an edition in 2000. I wondered why in paperback and in English. A famous German scholar writing in paperback, publishing in paperback in English. Then he published this book in German in a very good publishing house, Morsiebeck in Tübingen, 1 year before his death. So much later than the original English publication. Probably, I suspect that he was simply afraid of such an idea, that, as he argued, Matthew could be dependent on Luke and not simply on the so-called cursors, as it was generally assumed by traditional German scholarship. So in order not to be ridiculed by so many friends and colleagues in Germany, he published it somewhere in English, in paperback. And then only 1 year before his death, when he had nothing to lose, he published it in German as well. So, scholarship is not always abstract analysis of sources. At times touches real events from the lives of scholars, and it's quite natural. So I think that my idea developed in this way. Yeah, what are the main points for my understanding of Matthew as being later than Luke? In fact, do not refer to Matthew and Luke. It refers to Matthew and Acts, but this is another topic which is quite complicated.
Yeah, I remember that you brought up in the book and also in our email exchange that you focus mainly on the parallels between Matthew and Acts, or like at least you want to concentrate on that. And I noticed that you often brought up that Matthew lifts a lot of its material and enhances many parts of Acts of the Apostles. Does this happen more often when in other words, does Matthew borrow from Acts more often than it does from Luke in that respect?
My idea, and this is an original idea, and I think that's okay. First, let's start with the perspective, with the broad perspective. Scholars who work on the so-called synoptic problem, which refers to the relationships between the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, generally disregard the Acts of the Apostles. I don't know for what reason, because most scholars agree that the Acts of the Apostles is the second volume of the Gospel of Luke. So if we take Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then why disregard Acts? Why not taking Acts into consideration in the whole discussion? It is almost never discussed by the scholars, probably because of our limitations of our perception and also of our universities. At my university, there is one professor who teaches the Synoptic Gospels, and another professor who teaches the Acts of the Apostles with the Pauline tradition. So this is again something that is that should be overcome in our study of the New Testament. So this is the first observation, that the Acts should be taken into consideration seriously in the whole dispute over the synoptic problem. Then, what about Matthew and Acts? My original idea is that Matthew simply followed Acts in terms of the sequence of the ideas. I traced 500 correspondences between the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, and the Acts of the Apostles, which are taken one after another in a sequence, a very long sequence of 500 elements. It's a very long series of correspondences. If you take the whole work of the Acts of the Apostles and you compare the Gospel of Matthew with them, then you will trace these correspondences one after another. And there are not just 10 or 20 of them, but 500, which gives, I think, credibility to my solution to the synoptic problem, and also the relationship between Matthew and Acts. So, if you ask whether Matthew referred to Acts more often than to the Gospel of Luke, I must say that the answer is not simply whether it was more often or not. Matthew's use of Acts is much more fundamental, because he follows the sequence of ideas of the Acts of the Apostles, and only on a secondary level he uses Mark and Luke, the Gospel of Luke, to illustrate these ideas. So the Acts of the Apostles is the key hypotext for him, and the Gospel is one of the additional hypothexts, together with the Gospel of Mark.
What do you think are the most, like, if you could provide examples, like some of the best examples of Matthew lifting material from Acts?
These ideas are reworked in a creative way. So these are not direct quotations, although there are some borrowings, literary borrowings. But more often, Matthew, as other evangelists did, he used his hypertext in a creative way. So, for example, if you want to have some examples, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, the three magi, or the magi, we do not know how many of them, in fact, came to Jesus and brought three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Which is strange, because in the underlying hypertext of Isaiah, we only have two gifts: gold and incense. Why the third gift? If we follow the story of Acts, we have a similar idea of 3,000 converts converted to the new belief, and they bring gifts to the apostles. So the hypertextual procedure consists in changing the apostles to Jesus and the new converts to the Gentile magi who come from the east and bring their gifts to Jesus. Why three? Because there were 300 of them and not two, as was in Isaiah. So this is just one of the examples. Another example, a very interesting example to me, is, for example, the order of the temptations. Now we are in time. So Matthew changed the order of the two last temptations from the Gospel of Luke. So, for example, we have first the wilderness, then the city, which he calls the city, not Jerusalem, but the city, and then a very high mountain on which Jesus is tempted to have dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth. And we have a similar sequence in the end of chapter 8 of the Acts of the Apostles, when Philip goes first to the plain, then to the cities of the coast, and then to Caesarea. And the name Caesarea is here important because it was the seat of the Roman governor, and it represented Caesar, the most powerful emperor who governed all the kingdoms of the earth. Or, for example, another example, just a small element, that the fame of Jesus spread all over Syria. It is strange because we are in Judea here, in Galilee, and not in Syria. Syria is up there in Damascus, north, and not in Galilee. So how is it possible that the fame of Jesus suddenly spread all over Syria? If we follow the story of the Acts of the Apostles, after chapter 8, there is chapter 9 with the conversion of Saul, and he is active in Damascus. So Matthew took this idea of being active in Damascus, preaching in Damascus. Moreover, he preached in such a way that all people heard and were amazed. So the fame of Saul spread in Damascus. And when Matthew learned this story, he changed Paul to Jesus and Paul's fame to Jesus' fame. And we have this fame in Syria now in the Gospel of Matthew. Then we come to the mountain. Again, Matthew changes Luke's sermon on the plain to the sermon on the mountain, which is strange because there are people. Jesus, instead of taking a microphone and speaking to people, he goes up there to the mountain. He takes disciples. Where from, no one knows, because there was only the calling of Peter and Andrew. And suddenly he has some examples, and he engages in teaching on the mountain up there, where there is no one there, just his disciples. And a similar idea is found in the Acts of the Apostles. What happens to Saul after his conversion? He goes up there to the city of Jerusalem, up there on the mountain, Mount Zion. He has his disciples, the disciples that are around him, the Jewish Christian disciples, and he engages in preaching to the Hellenists. So again, instead of Paul, we have Jesus here. So Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, as in the Gospel of Mark, the same, he in many times represents the character of Paul, Saul, Paul, from the tradition, which is important from the theological point of view. That the Jesus of the Gospels also includes the features of his chosen apostles. The Jesus of the Gospels is not simply the historical figure of the one who lived in Jerusalem surroundings, but the Jesus of the Gospels also contains the features of his chosen apostles who spread the gospel to the nations. Maybe just another example, if you ask, which is theological, very important. We have in the Gospel of Matthew, only in this Gospel, the surprising idea of all Jews commonly taking responsibility for killing Jesus, condemning him to the cross upon their nation, an idea which has great theological and also, alas, the whole Holocaust and so on, social consequences until now. We have this idea at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul is accused, and the Jews around him in Jerusalem commonly take the responsibility for killing Paul upon themselves. So the whole so-called anti-Judaism of the Gospel of Matthew, which is a great theological and social problem, the Christian-Jewish relationships, in fact arises from the Acts of the Apostles, from the depiction of the Jews as commonly taking responsibility upon their nation for killing Paul. So we should consider these ideas not just as abstract ideas of what happened, but also in the bearing on the societies in which we live today, in our histories, Christians, Jews living together for 2 millennia.
Yeah, I remember that you were talking about in the book, and you also briefly mentioned this, that Luke seems to be closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls than Matthew is. If I remember correctly, I think you brought up the Damascus document in particular when you were suggesting Luke is closer to the scrolls. Could you explain and Luke's usage of the Damascus document in relations to it being closer to the scrolls than Matthew is?
For example, we have a story in the Gospel of Mark of Jesus healing a man with the dry hand. Xeran, eichenden, heira. Xeros, like Xerox, xerography, dry printing. Xeros, xeran, eichenden, heira. Heira is the hand. And the healing is quite simple, the day of the Sabbath, and then the following discussion with the Pharisees, with the people around him, whether it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not. This is I would say, normal Markan story. In the Gospel of Luke, we have the same story in its normal place, and we have another version of the story in chapter 14, which closely resembles the Markan original text. But then there, certain elements are changed. For example, instead of the man having a dry hand, he is full of water. Instead of being dry, xeros, he's hydropikos. Today we call him the man in dropsy. Because in fact he is as though he were in a body of water. Which is strange. How is it possible that the man with the withered hand, dry hand, now has become a man full of water, in a body full of water? Moreover, the action of Jesus here in this case is very strange, because the Gospel of Luke says that he caught the man, or grasped the man, epilabomenos, auton. What is it? Does not make any literal sense. How is it possible that Jesus simply caught the man or grasped the man? What for? What reason? He could just have extended his hand and healed the man, but he grasped the man, epilabomenos. If we read the Damascus document, we have a similar discussion in the so-called column 11 concerning what is lawful and what is not lawful to do on the day of the Sabbath. And we have an example, a halachic example. Halacha is a discussion of legal things in Judaism. We have a halachic example of a man who is drowned in a pit full of water. In a pit full of water. And then the discussion goes, is it lawful to save such a man on the day of the Sabbath or not? What do you think? Are you allowed to save such a man who fell into a pit full of water? Is it lawful or unlawful? Allowed or not allowed to save such a man on the day of the Sabbath? What would you say?
My next question is
Just a moment, because we need an answer here.
oh, okay. Well, I got lost. Sorry. What was the question? Could you repeat it?
There is the Damascus document, column 11, discusses a case of someone who has fallen into a pit full of water. And he's drowned in this water, somewhere in a pit. And now the question goes in the Damascus document, is it lawful or not lawful, allowed or not allowed, to save such a man in this water on the day of the Sabbath?
I remember. Yeah, I know what you're talking about now. I remember someone discussed that with me before on I think it was a previous video. But yeah, if I remember correctly,
the answer is
it
that
is not.
you are allowed to save such a man, provided that only hand and no tool is used. That you use no tool, because using a tool would violate the commandment of the Sabbath. It would be working. If you do not use any tool, for example, any ladder and a cloth or something, and a rope, you only use your hand and you catch the man and lift him up from the pit of water, full of water, then it is lawful to do such a thing on the day of the Sabbath. If you use a tool, then it is not lawful. So we have the reworking of this idea in the Gospel of Luke. What does Jesus do on the day of the Sabbath, according to this story concerning the man, now not more with the withered hand, with the dry hand, but with the man who is caught in his body full of water? Jesus catches him using no tool. So apparently, according to the rule of the Damascus document, which is not contained in the Bible, in the Old Testament, it's the regulation from the Damascus document, Jesus' action here is legal, is lawful, is allowed. Moreover, we have here an idea of the Pharisees. In one of my latest articles, on this basis, I argued that most important, at least the most important writings among the Dead Sea Scrolls are in fact Pharisaic. Because not Essene as it is usually assumed, but Pharisaic, because we have distinctively Pharisaic ideas here, like the one with the man full of water.
So in that case, Matthew's gospel doesn't really have that going on there. So it's therefore more distant from the document that you just mentioned than Luke is. So Luke is more, in other words, your point is Luke is more focused on the scrolls, which means it must be reasonably earlier than Matthew's gospel, because Luke shows a greater knowledge of the scrolls than Matthew does.
Yes, and the scrolls and the arguments, the halakhic discussions, Jewish halakhic discussions that are contained in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I gave you the example of this using of the idea which is not biblical, which cannot be found in Leviticus, for example. It's only in the Damascus document. And it's applied by Luke in his reasoning that what Jesus did is according to the rule of the Damascus document, it is lawful. When you take the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew has a parallel story about this healing of the man with dropsy, but he apparently does not understand the whole argument, because he destroys the whole idea of catching the man who is full of water. Matthew includes here a strange story about saving a sheep, which is borrowed from Luke 15, a lost sheep parable. So for Matthew, he knows that the bell rings, but he does not know where. He borrows the idea from the Gospel of Luke, but in fact, he does not know the halakhic argument that was present in the Damascus document. For him, this halakhic argument means nothing. So he simply takes the story from the Gospel of Luke, but he apparently does not understand the Jewish idea that is contained in this story. If you take the Matthean version of this story, it's simply about saving an animal, saving a sheep, which is not the problem in the Damascus document. The problem was with the human. Is it lawful to save a man like me and you on the day of the Sabbath if we fall into the body or pit full of water? It's not about animals, it's about humans.
Scholars often say that Luke's sayings of Christ are they tend to be more primitive more often than Matthew's sayings of Christ, yet conclude, despite that it is the third gospel anyway. With Luke being the second gospel instead, do you think the Q document is still, or not necessarily, a necessity to explain the sayings of Christ found in both Luke and Matthew, but not in Mark?
This is a good question. The whole idea of the Q source began in the late 18th century, when scholars were dissatisfied with the previous solutions to the synoptic problem. There were some solutions to the synoptic problem, but scholars were dissatisfied with that. They thought that the pattern of similarity between the Gospels is too great to be explained only in terms of oral traditions, because there are so many common wording and ideas, and also order of pericopes that follow one after another in the same sequence that they cannot be explained simply by recourse to oral traditions. Moreover, they thought that the solution which was first applied, namely of the one primitive proto-gospel, lost later proto-gospel, does not explain the data that we have in the Gospels adequately. So one German scholar, Eichhorn, had the idea that the evangelists must have relied on some sources. How many sources? For him, it was not just one Q source. In order to explain the data, he postulated the existence of 10 sources, because the pattern of relationships between the Gospels is really complex. So then later scholars limited the number of these sources generally to Mark and Q. The idea is that if there is some similarity between the Gospels, you must postulate a source behind it, which is in fact postponing the problem from the Gospels to their sources, but the problem remains. How is it possible? Let's start with simple history. How is it possible that there was a Q source, which is thought to be a very important early Christian document, originating generally, scholars think, from Palestine, somewhere from Palestine? How is it possible that, for example, it was not known to Paul at all? It was not known to Mark as well. Most Q scholars would agree that Mark did not know the Q source. How is it possible that for decades no one knew this Q source? Then it became apparently very important to both Matthew and Luke, as it is argued independently of each other, working in two different social and theological milieux, nevertheless both using the same Q source, and then it disappeared. So the pattern of its existence and non-existence is really curious. First, it apparently not existed. Then it was very, very significant to Matthew and Luke, and then it disappeared. And we do not have it today, unless we take the Leuven reconstruction of it, the critical edition of the Q source. We have a critical edition of something that never existed. Scholars do such things in order to become professors. It's funny. We have a critical edition of the Q source, although we have no manuscript of this Q source and nothing. But there is a critical edition, and people made it. So how is it possible, in terms of historical plausibility, that such a Q source ever existed, and then it simply disappeared, although it was so significant for the history of early Christianity. It's good to have here a point of comparison, namely the letters of Paul. Paul wrote letters that were widespread. He wrote his letters to the most important cities of the Mediterranean. His letters were known in Jerusalem, in Antioch, in Ephesus, in Athens, in Corinth, in Philippi, in Thessaloniki, in Rome, so the most important cities of the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, it is argued that neither Matthew nor Luke used them. How is it possible that they used an unknown Q source, which was unknown to anyone, but they apparently did not know Paul's letters, which were known to everyone? So, especially in comparison to the Pauline letters, it becomes really implausible, historically implausible, that such a Q source ever existed. It is a product of scholarly, I would say, both necessity and also scholars like something that is hypothetical. Why? Because they can shape it as they want, like clay. You know, if you have a manuscript with a text, an ancient text, you need to analyze this text. You need to first make critical edition of it, text critical work, and so on and so on. If you have a hypothetical source like Q, you may do everything with it. And anyone who does it becomes a professor, because he has another idea concerning the Q source. There's no control here. If you have a manuscript, there is control point. This is the text that is somehow preserved in the manuscript.
That's a good
If
point.
you don't have any manuscript, you may do anything you want, and anything goes. Your imagination, you know, you create the Q source according to your needs. It may be lengthy, it may be short, it may have been written in Greek or Aramaic. It's up to you what you want. There's no control in this whole research.
There are some that try to get around that problem that, the reason why the Q document the reason why the Q document was not known by Paul and Mark was because it was actually written between Mark and Matthew. You ever heard of that before?
Yes, of course.
What do you think about that?
Yes, of course. Now we encounter problems and problems and problems. First, you asked about the time. Let's ask about the place. Where could it have been written? People argue that it was written in Galilee. It contains distinctively Galilean ideas. It's widespread. Why? Because the Jesus of the Q source is a talking head, like hippie. There is no cross, no resurrection, no church, no Peter, and so on. Jesus simply talks and tells stories, and it's all. So he resembles a wandering charismatic, a wandering hippie, something like this. So people argue that it originates from Galilee. Nevertheless, most people agree that it was written in Greek. For example, because our daily bread, epousios, is a typically Greek word that is not. It's a new coined word that is only known from the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. It does not reflect any Aramaic underlying idea here. So the place and language of the Q source is in fact implausible. Then what about Mark's use of Q? As you say, there are some people who postulate the temporal, chronological assignment of Q between Paul and Mark. Is it possible that Mark knew Q? Of course, it is possible. But then, what is the reaction of Mark to the Q source? In fact, we have almost nothing of this Q source in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark contains more than 600 verses. How many of them could have been influenced by the ideas of the Q source? Maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe 40. This is the so-called Mark-Q overlap. Some people say that there is some overlap between Mark and the Q source, but this is very limited. So how is it possible that there was, as people argue, a very ancient and reputable source concerning the historical Jesus, which originated from Galilee or from the first believers, and so on and so on. And then Mark, who writes the first biography of Jesus, at least it seems to be a biography, although this is not a biography, takes this Q source and uses it, maybe 5% of it or something like this, and simply disregards it. How is it possible? And then we encounter another problem, the whole business of the so-called Mark-Q overlap. The Q theorists explain the relationship between the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, in terms of three distinct categories. In the fragments in which Matthew and Luke generally agree with each other, but there is no significant markant parallels to these stories, they postulate here the existence of the Q source. If these fragments have more counterpart in Mark, then they say this is the so-called overlap between Mark and Q. If there is much markant parallel here, they say that these are minor agreements. That Mark and Luke agree here in the Markan text. How is it possible that they borrow from Mark and nevertheless they agree not with Mark but with each other, not knowing each other, as most scholars assume that Matthew did not know Luke and Luke did not know Matthew. How is it possible that they used Mark and they changed the Markan text hundreds of times? One scholar counted 1,200 times, independently of each other in the same way. Is it not possible? If you rework a source, you may have some ideas, corrections that are similar to another corrector, but not so many times. It's impossible. So in fact, what we have here are not three distinct categories: Q source, Mark Q overlap, and minor agreement, but there's a continuum of Matthean reworking of Luke. At times it's more faithful, at times it's more loose, at times it's closer to Mark, at times it's more distant than Mark. Let's take an example, the famous prayer, Our Father. Where does it belong? Does it belong to the Q source? Does it belong to the Mark Q overlap? Does it belong to the minor agreements? Most scholars today, Q scholars, would assign the Our Father prayer to the Q source, and they say it originates from the Q source. But if you take the Gospel of Mark, we have something like this, a short, very short version of it, also in the Gospel of Mark, 11:25. When you pray, then forgive to your enemies, and it will be forgiven to you. So we have something like the Lord's Prayer also in the Gospel of Mark, which means that probably it, according to the Q source, this is not Q, this is Mark Q overlap. It complicates the whole idea. If I take my hypothesis, simply Mark, Luke, and Matthew, we simply have here Matthew following Luke, but also Mark, and it's quite simple.
So in other words, redating the Q document either in between Paul and Mark or in between Mark and Matthew instead to explain either Paul's ignorance of Q or both Paul and Mark's ignorance of the Q document is simply begging the question and doesn't really solve much problems at all. What do you think about Papias? Because Papias says that Matthew wrote his sayings of Christ in an orderly fashion, but before that, some person called Ariston wrote a sayings of Christ. He's also referred to as Aristo in other cases. So he wrote a sayings of Christ and put it in a document that he did not describe the same way as Matthew's sayings of Christ, and thus did not use the word orderly. That is, Papias did not use the word orderly when describing Ariston's sayings of Christ in his description of Ariston's work. Would you say that this situation is similar to the dilemma that Matthew used Luke Acts? In other words, would you say that it's possible Papias is aware that Matthew postdates Luke from what he just said?
Yes, the famous testimony of Papias is usually taken in two different parts. People want to refer to the testimony of Papias in order to say that Matthew relies on some logia, some sayings of Jesus. But then they take it out of the context. In its context, we have a discussion concerning two Gospels. First, the Gospel of Mark, and then the Gospel of Matthew. And Papias says that the Gospel of Matthew is written not in an orderly way, not in an orderly way. It's a problem that needs to be solved, although it was based on Peter's preaching and so on, it is not ordered, What to do with such a problem? He says that so, and this conjunction here is important, so, homen un in Greek means so, thus, therefore, Matthew took these sayings of the Lord and ordered them in an order way, syntaxato. So according to Papias, with this conjunction, which is important here, between linking the two accounts concerning the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, what we have here is an image of Matthew as a response to Mark's lack of order. Then the problem arises. If Matthew reworked the Gospel of Mark in a way to create order in this not ordered story of Mark, what could he have changed? He says the answer of Papias is that he changed the logia. This is the first idea that we have in the history of Christianity, that the Gospel is not taken as a whole, as a narrative work, as a literary work, but that it is a composition, a set of individual, today we call them pericopes, fragments, that can be isolated one from another and called, say, sayings, stories, pericopes, fragments, and so on and so on. I consider the Gospels as literary works which were written from the beginning to the end, and they have their internal logic, each one of them. The solution given by Papias is a solution that was taken in the so-called form critical research of the Gospels, that you may simply take the Gospels not as extant literary works from the beginning to the end, but you may take them as, say, baskets with some individual stories, sayings, and so on, which can be isolated from one another, and then you may compare them, which is more original, which is a reworking of the other, and so on and so on. But then you lose control over the whole thing. I take the Gospels as long narratives that have their logic. If you divide the Gospels into individual fragments, you have no means to ascertain the priority and posteriority between them. It's almost impossible because we have no means in terms of literary research to take two stories which are similar to each other and say which is earlier, which is later. I know it because, as I said at the beginning, I started my research here on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I first compared the so-called penal codes in the Damascus document and in the community rule. We have both texts, Damascus document and community rule. We have several text critical versions of them in various manuscripts. We have no dates, no context. How to say which is more original and which is a reworking of the other? It's impossible. You may have various criteria. This is longer, this is shorter, this is more succinct, this is more elaborate. Nevertheless, you do not know. It's impossible. The penal codes are similar here and there, and you have no means of saying which is earlier, which is later. So, and this is one of the weaknesses of the whole research on the synoptic problem, because scholars believe that they are able to do such judgments, and I think it's not. The whole approach, in fact, originates with Papias, who divided the Gospels into stories, into sayings, logia, and then you may do with these logias what you want.
Hmm.
In fact, it's impossible to date them or assess their relative priority and posteriority if you take just isolated stories. For example, the two versions of Our Father. You may say that the Matthean one is later than the Lucan one. But then another scholar could come and say, I think that is the reverse. That Luke simply abbreviated the longer Matthean version. Why not? Abbreviation is also a literary procedure, like elaboration. And you have no real literary means of ascertaining the priority and posteriority of two texts which are similar to each other. And this is the source of the whole so-called of the whole synoptic problem. Because scholars think that they take the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they use some criteria and they say Matthew is more original, Luke is more original. But how is it possible to do it?
What would you say are the main issues that Matthean posteriority solves that the other proposed solutions to the synoptic problem fail to do, such as the two source hypothesis, the four document hypothesis, or the thorough hypothesis? Which the thorough hypothesis is, interestingly, is similar in the sense that, okay, it dismisses the Q document, but Luke knows Matthew and Matthew knows Mark, and that's the end of the story. Whereas your position reverses that and says it's really Mark to Luke to Matthew, and Matthew borrowed from Mark and Luke.
Yes. The first advantage of this hypothesis is the Occam's razor. You do not need to postulate anything hypothetical here. What we discuss here in my hypothesis is only the extant text that we know from the manuscript. I do not postulate any lost sources here, any Q source, any pre-Markan, post-Markan, like Proto-Mark, Deuteronomy, and so on, and the lost sources. The developed two-source theory, in fact, also includes the Matthew's source, particular M source, then the L source, according to Streeter. Then you have more than two sources, so you may, compose sources as you want. So I use the Occam's razor here. It's more difficult, it's more demanding, but it's more reliable. If you take the manuscripts, the text that you find in the manuscripts, and you discuss them, instead of postulating the explanation of unknown by unknown. So the Occam's razor is, I think, very important in the biblical research. Then what's the advantage of the Matthean posteriority hypothesis against the thorough solution? So they say that it was Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Luke being the third one. I don't want to delve into the whole discussion because, as I said, you may endlessly debate the priority and posteriority of individuals.
Sure. Yeah.
That is why I say what I do is the inclusion of the Acts of the Apostles. I say that Matthew, Luke used not so much the Gospel of Luke, he used the Acts of the Apostles. If someone goes for the thorough hypothesis, let him answer the question, what about the Acts of the Apostles? If Luke used Matthew in his Gospel, what did he do in Acts? Does Acts betray any knowledge of Matthew or not? Apart from the story of the suicide of Judas at the beginning. How is it possible that in the Gospel, Luke heavily used Matthew, and then he simply disregarded Matthew's ideas in the Acts of the Apostles, in the second volume of his work? That is why I argue that my version of the Matthean posteriority hypothesis is the right one. So I do not simply follow the so-called MPH, as it is today abbreviated by Alan Garrow and others, Matthean posteriority hypothesis. I prefer my own version of it, namely including the Acts of the Apostles. If you do not include the Acts of the Apostles, you lose an important factor here, as we said at the beginning. Luke wrote 2 volumes and not just one. Why disregard the Acts? I always ask scholars about the Acts. What do you do with Acts? how is it possible that you simply forget the Acts of the Apostles if Luke wrote them? So I think that this version of the Matthean posteriority hypothesis really explains the data. We do not need to postulate any lost source here. We have the difficulty to working with manuscripts and not inventing what we want, some Q sources and so on, which are easily manipulable by scholars according to their needs. We take the hard task of understanding the text as we have in the manuscript. And what I suggest, what I propose, is to understand the Gospel of Matthew as a reworking of the ideas of the Acts of the Apostles. One of the most important ideas of Luke and Acts is the recourse to the Old Testament. Mark wrote a distinctively Pauline Gospel with a Pauline message. Now Luke, in both the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, goes back to the Old Testament in order to prove like the letter to the Romans, the continuity between the Old Testament and the Pauline Gospel. We have the idea from the letter to the Romans. Matthew does the same in order to prove that the Gospel of Jesus and the life of Jesus was written in the Old Testament. Of course, this is another idea taken from the letter to the Romans. In terms of history, because we are interested in history here, maybe this is a hypothesis. I'm not sure here, but this is just a hint. Maybe the whole issue of Luke and Matthew already touches the issue of Marcion's activity in Rome. I think that Mark was written at the beginning of the 2nd century.
So you date the 4 Gospels to the 2nd century?
Yes, all 4 of them, because they are later than Josephus. I argue in my works that all 4 evangelists used the works of Josephus, and at least one of them, Antiquities, is relatively reliably dated to 93-94.
So in other words, the 4 Gospels use Josephus.
Yes. This is the only point for dating the Gospels. We do not have other points of reference. The paleographical dating of the Gospel of John, which was traditionally assigned to 125, now it turned to be just an idea to be forgotten. New paleographical research says that it's impossible. It can be dated to the end of the 2nd century. So we have no other means to date the Gospels apart from the work of Josephus, his Antiquity. Maybe some allusions to the events, but allusions are always difficult to prove. An allusion is simply an allusion. We have an allusion, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, that at the end of Jesus' activity in Jerusalem, he says that the Jews say that if we follow Jesus, then the Romans will come and take our place. Sorry, forget it. another argument here, that there will be the deligma, how it translated into, the abomination will be in the holy place. The desolation of abomination will be in the holy place. We know that after the Jewish war, the Romans conquered Jerusalem and burned down the temple. But only after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, they erected a pagan temple there. And the Gospel of Matthew may contain here an allusion to this action of the Romans, that we have the desolation of abomination in the holy place, which means the sacred place of the temple. But let's come back to the Marcions business in Rome. It is possible that the Gospel of Mark, if it was written at the beginning of the 2nd century, it was the Pauline Gospel, and Marcion agreed with it because it was still the literary reworking of the Pauline ideas. But then came Luke, who tried to prove, in line with the ideas of the letter to the Romans, that the gospel, the Pauline gospel, is rooted in the Old Testament. And Marcion protests against this idea. So probably Matthew is an answer to Marcion. That it is possible to prove that the activity of Jesus, the whole gospel of Jesus, is rooted in the Old Testament. So the problem is not so much with the Palestinian Christians. The problem is with the Roman Christians. And Rome is the capital of the empire. Judea was a lost province somewhere in the east. But here we have Rome, the capital of the empire. And the question is whether Marcion was right or wrong. We know from history that the Marcionite crisis was very, very deep and painful to early Christians. And we needed an answer to this claim by Marcion that they adulterate the gospel, the true Pauline gospel, with the recourses to the Old Testament ideas. And probably Matthew is a response to this Marcionite question or claim to go back to Paul and the simple Pauline gospel.
So just to be sure I understand this correctly, so Mark is Mark first, then Luke, and then Marcion is after Luke. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe, yes, maybe.
Okay.
So this is only a hypothesis. I'm not in a position to prove it. It's only a suggestion, to let us think about it.
Right.
And then Matthew could be written after 135, probably 145 to 150. Marcion came to Rome in 144. So if we take Matthew after the Bar Kokhba revolt, we are in the same time. So today, many scholars following Richard Perver date the Acts of the Apostles to 130. So
how late would you place the Gospel of John? How late in the 2nd century are we looking there?
Later, 150, 160.
Okay.
Not much later, because then we have already, the patristic use of the Gospels. At the beginning, very scanty. I mean here, Justin, his Apology. At the beginning, it's very scanty. It's surprising that Justin makes almost no use of the Gospels in his dialogue with Tryphon, the Jew, and so on and so on. There are some scanty references to the Gospels, but they are known here at the beginning, 160, something like this. And then we have the paleographical dating of the Gospel of John to the end of the 2nd century, the 52.
Well, thank you for joining me. This has been definitely a fascinating talk, and I hope to eventually have you return, because I definitely enjoyed this conversation very much. And I like what you're doing and sticking with the text that we have, instead of some of these other people that I've interviewed before. It's like, okay, there's like an M, there's an L, Antiochus document, hypothetical documents, like the Streeter 4-document hypothesis. So, Burton L. Max, like 3-4 different Q documents, or there's 3-4 different earlier marks that we don't know, that we can't prove existed. So yeah, I like that. I really do.
So welcome to the MPH hypothesis, and welcome to Matthew's look of the Acts of the Apostles. It's difficult, the use of extant texts is always more difficult. But if you want to become a professor, you'd better invent an unknown source.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.